Doomsday Book and Beyond by Frederick William Maitland. Essay 1. Doomsday Book. Doomsday Book and its Satellites. At midwinter in the year 1085, William the Conqueror wore his crown at Gloucester, and there he had deep speech with his wise men. The outcome of that speech was the mission throughout all England of barons, legates, or justices charged with the duty of collecting from the verdicts of the shires, the hundreds, and the vills a descriptio of his new realm. The outcome of that mission was the descriptio preserved for us in 2 manuscript volumes, which within a century after their making had already acquired the name of Doomsday Book. Doomsday, a Geld Book. To say that Doomsday Book is no collection of laws or treaties on law would be needless. Very seldom does it state any rule in general terms, and when it does so, we shall usually find cause for believing that this rule is itself an exception, a local custom, a provincial privilege. Thus, if we are to come by general rules, we must obtain them inductively by a comparison of many thousand particular instances. But further, Doomsday Book is no register of title, no register of all those rights and facts which constitute the system of landholdership. One great purpose seems to mold both its form and its substance. It is a Geld Book. Danegeld. When Duke William became king of the English, he found among the most valuable of his newly acquired regalia a right to levy a land tax under the name of geld or danegeld. A detailed history of that tax cannot be written. It is under the year 991 that our English chronicle first mentions a tribute paid to the Danes. £10,000 was then paid to them. In 994, the yet larger sum of £16,000 was levied. With a Dane upon the throne, this tribute seems to have become an occasional war tax. How often it was levied we cannot tell, but that it was levied more than once by the confessor is not doubtful. We are told that he abolished it in or about the year 1051, some 8 or 9 years after his accession, some 15 before his death. No sooner was William crowned than he laid on men a geld exceeding stiff. In the next year he set a mickle geld on the people. In the winter of 1083-4 he raised a geld of 72 pence upon the hide. But grievous as was the tax which immediately preceded the making of the survey, we are not entitled to infer that it was of unprecedented severity. If the huge sums mentioned by the chronicler had really been exacted, and that too within the memory of men who were yet living, William might well regard the right to levy a geld as the most precious jewel in his English crown. To secure a due and punctual payment of it was worth a gigantic effort, a survey such as had never been made, and a record such as had never been penned since the grandest days of the old Roman Empire. But further, the assessment of the geld sadly needed reform. Owing to one cause and another, owing to privileges and immunities that had been capriciously granted, owing also, so we think, to a radically vicious method of computing the geldable areas of counties and hundreds, the old assessment was full of anomalies and iniquities. Some estates were overrated, others were scandalously underrated. That William intended to correct the old assessment, or rather to sweep it away and put a new assessment in its stead, seems highly probable, though it has not been proved that either he or his sons accomplished this feat. All the lands, all the landholders of England may be brought before us, but we are told only of such facts, such rights, such legal relationships as bear on the actual or potential payment of geld. Here and there the peculiar customs of a shire or a borough will be stated, and incidentally the services that certain tenants owe to their lords may be noticed. But all this is done sporadically and unsystematically. Our record is no register of title. It is no feudary. It is no feudary. It is no customal. It is no rent roll. It is a tax book, a geld book. The survey and the geld system. We say this not by way of vain complaint against its meagerness, but because in our belief a care for geld and for all that concerns the assessment and payment of geld colors far more deeply than commentators have usually supposed the information that is given to us about other matters. We should not be surprised if definitions and distinctions, which at first sight have little enough to do with fiscal arrangements, for example, the definition of a manor and the distinction between a villein and a free man, involved references to the apportionment and the levy of the land tax. Often enough it happens that legal ideas of a very general kind are defined by fiscal rules. For example, our modern English idea of occupation has become so much part and parcel of a system of assessment that lawyers are always ready to argue that a certain man must be an occupier because such men as he are rated to the relief of the poor. 2. The serfs. The serfs in Domesday Book. The existence of some 25,000 serfs is recorded. In the 13th century, servus and villanus are, at least among lawyers, equivalent words. The only unfree man is the serf villain, and the lawyers are trying to subject him to the curious principle that he is the Lord's chattel, but a free man in relation to all but his Lord. It is far otherwise in Domesday Book. In entry after entry and county after county, the servi are kept well apart from the villani, bordari, cotari. Often they are mentioned in quite another context to that in which the villani are enumerated. As an instance, we may take a manor in survey. In Demesne there are 5 teams and there are 25 villani, and 6 bordari, with 14 teams. There is 1 mill of 2 shillings, and 1 fishery, and 1 church, and 4 acres of meadow, and wood for 150 pannage pigs, and 2 stone quarries of 2 shillings, and 2 nests of hawks in the wood, and 10 servi. Often enough the servi are placed between 2 other sources of wealth, the church and the mill. Legal position of the serf. Of the legal position of the servus, Domesday Book tells us little or nothing, but earlier and later documents oblige us to think of him as a slave, one who in the main has no legal rights. He is the thou of the Anglo-Saxon dooms, the servus of the ecclesiastical canons. But though we do right in calling him a slave, still we might well be mistaken were we to think of the line which divides him from other men as being as sharp as the line which a mature jurisprudence will draw between thing and person. We may well doubt whether this principle, the slave is a thing, not a person, can be fully understood by a grossly barbarous age. It implies the idea of a person, and in a world of sense we find not persons but men. Pradial element in serfage. In the second place, we may guess that from a remote time there has been in the condition of the thou a certain element of pradiality. The slaves have not been worked in gangs nor housed in barracks. The servus has often been a servus cassitus. He has had a cottage or even a manse and a yard land, which de facto he might call his own. There is here no legal limitation of his master's power. Some slave trade there has been, but on the whole it seems probable that the thou has been usually treated as annexed to a tenement. The duties exacted of him from year to year have remained constant. The consequence is that a free man in return for a plot of land may well agree to do all that a thou usually does, and see in this no descent into slavery. Thus the slave gets a chance of acquiring what will be, as a matter of fact, a peculium. In the 7th century the Church tried to turn this matter of fact into matter of law. Non licet homini, says Theodore's Penitentiary. Non licet homini, says Theodore's Penitential. Acervo tollere pecuniam quam ipse labore suo adquiescerit. We have no reason for thinking that this effort was very strenuous or very successful, or that the law of the 11th century allowed the service any propriety of rights, and yet he might often be the occupier of land and of chattels, with which, so long as he did his customary services, his lord would seldom meddle. The serf in criminal law. In the third place, we may believe that for some time past police law and punitive law have been doing something to conceal, if not to obliterate, the line which separates the slave from other men. A mature jurisprudence may be able to hold fast the fundamental principle that a slave is not a person but a thing, while at the same time it both limits the master's power of abusing his human chattel and guards against those dangers which may arise from existence of things which have wills, and sometimes bad wills, of their own. But an immature jurisprudence is capable of this exploit. It begins to play fast and loose with its elementary notions. It begins to punish the criminous slave without being quite certain as to how far it is punishing him and how far it is punishing his master. Confusion is easy, for if the slave be punished by death or mutilation, his master will suffer, and a pecuniary mulct exacted from the slave is exacted from his master. For a long time past the law has had before it the difficult problem of dealing with crimes and delicts committed by poor and economically dependent free men who have no land of their own, who are here today and gone tomorrow, men from whom no right can be had. It has been endeavoring to make the lords answerable to a certain extent for the misdeeds of their free retainers. If a slave is charged with a crime, his master is bound to produce him in court. But the law requires that the lord shall in very similar fashion produce his free loaf-eater, his mainpast. Nay, it has been endeavoring to enforce the rule that every free man has no land of his own, shall have a lord bound to produce him when he is accused. Also, it has been fostering the growth of private justice. The lord's duty of producing his men, bond and free, has been becoming the duty of holding a court in which his men, free and bound, will answer for themselves. 8. The feudal superstructure. Dependent tenure. The general theory that all land tenure, except indeed the tenure by which the king holds land in a Demesne, 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 Demesne. Demesne is dependent tenor, seems to be implied not only by many particular entries, but also by the whole scheme of the book. Every holder of land except the king holds it of some lord, and therefore every acre of land that is not royal demesne can be arranged under the name of some tenant in chief. Even a church will hold its land, if not of the king, then of some other lord. The terms of the tenor are but very rarely described, for Domesday Book is no feodary. We shall remark, however, the absence of those abstract terms which are to become the names of the various tenors. We read of Cervantes, Socmani, Villani, Bergenses, but not of Surantia, Socagium, Velenagium, Bergagium. As we pursue our retrogressive course through the Middle Ages, we do not find that the law of personal condition becomes more and more distinct from the law of land tenor. On the contrary, the two become less and less separable. The king as landlord. King William is much richer than King Edward was. The Conqueror has been chary in appointing earls, and consequently he has in his hand not only the royal manors, but also a great many committal manors, to say nothing of some other estates which, for one reason or another, he has kept to himself. Edward had been rich, but when compared with his earls, he had not been extravagantly rich. The royal demesne had been a scattered territory. The king had something in most shires, but was far richer in some than in others. It was not so much in the number of his manors as in their size and value that he excelled the richest of his subjects. Somehow or another he had acquired many of those villes which were to be the smaller boroughs and the market towns of later days. We may well suppose that from of old the villes that a king would wish to get and to keep would be the flourishing villes, but again we cannot doubt that many a ville has prospered because it was the king's. The committal manors. As with the estates of the king, so with the estates of the earls, we find it impossible to distinguish between private property and official property. Certain manors are regarded as the manors of the shire. Certain villes are committal villes. They belong to the consulate. Hereditary right, tempered by outlawry, was fast becoming the title by which the earldoms were holden. The position of the house of Leofric of Mercia was far from being as strong as the position of the house of Rolf in Normandy, and yet we may be sure that King Harold would not have been able to treat the sons of Elfgar as removable officers. Private rights and governmental revenues. The wealth of the earls is a matter of great importance. If we subtract the estates of the king, the estates of the earls, and the estates of the churches, and as we shall see hereafter, the churches had obtained the bulk of their wealth directly from the kings. If we subtract again the lands which the king, the earls, the churches have granted to their thanes, The England of 1065 will not appear to us a land of very great landowners, and we may obtain a valuable hint as to one of the origins of feudalism. A vast amount of land is or has recently been held by office holders, by the holders of the kingship, the earlships, or the ealdormanships. We seem to see their proprietary rights arising in the sphere of public law, growing out of governmental rights, which however themselves are conceived as being in some sort of propriety. Many a passage in the Doomsday Book will suggest to us that a right to take tribute and a right to take the profits of justice have helped to give the king and the earls their manors and their seigneuries. The English state. If now we look at that English state which is the outcome of a purely English history, we see that it has already taken a pyramidal or conical shape. It is a society of lords and men. At its base are the cultivators of the soil. At its apex is the king. This cone is as yet but low. Even at the end of William's reign, the peasant seldom had more than 2 lords between him and the king. But already in the Confessor's reign, he might well have 3. Also, the cone is obtuse. The angle at its apex will grow acuter under Norman rulers. We can indeed obtain no accurate statistics, but the number of landholders who were King Edward's men must have been much larger than the tale of the Norman tenants in chief. In the geographical distribution of the large estates under William, there is but little more regularity than there was under his predecessor. Still, a great change took place in the substance of the cone, or if that substance is made up of lords and men and acres, than in the nature of, or rather the relation between, the forces which held the atoms together. Every change makes for symmetry, simplicity, consolidation. Some of these changes will seem to us predestined. But if England was not to be forever a prey to rebellions and civil wars, the power of the lords over their men must have been, not indeed increased, but territorialized. The liberty of going with one's land to whatever lord one chose must have been curtailed. As yet, the central force embodied in the kingship was too feeble to deal directly with every one of its subjects, to govern them and protect them. The intermediation of the lords was necessary. The state could not but be pyramidal, and while this was so, the freedom that men had of forsaking one lord for another, of forsaking even the king for the ambitious earl, was a freedom that was akin to anarchy. Such a liberty must have its wings clipped. Free contract must be taught to know its place. The lord's hold over the man's land must become permanent. Again, we may guess, if we please, that but for the Norman conquest, the mass of the English peasantry would never have fallen so low as fall it did. The sokemen would have hardly been turned into villeins. The villeins would hardly have become serfs. And yet the villeins of the Confessor's time were in a perilous position. Already they were occupying lands which for 2 most important purposes were reckoned the lands of their lords, lands for which their lords gelded, lands for which their lords fought. How the Catholic Church built with How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. Chapter 1. The Indispensable Church. Philip Jenkins, Distinguished Professor of History and Religious Studies at Pennsylvania State University, has called anti-Catholicism the one remaining acceptable prejudice in America. His assessment is difficult to dispute. In our media and popular culture, little is off limits when it comes to ridiculing or parodying the Church. My own students, to the extent that they know anything at all about the Church, are typically familiar only with alleged Church corruption, of which they heard ceaseless tales of varying credibility from their high school teachers. The story of Catholicism, as far as they know, is one of ignorance, repression, and stagnation. That Western civilization stands indebted to the Church for the university system, charitable work, international law, the sciences, important legal principles, and much else besides has not been impressed upon them with terrific zeal. Western civilization does not derive entirely from Catholicism, of course. One can scarcely deny the importance of ancient Greece and Rome, or the various Germanic tribes that succeeded the Roman Empire in the West as formative influences on our civilization. The Church repudiated none of these traditions, and in fact absorbed and learned from the best of them. With the exception of scholars of medieval Europe, most people believe that the 1,000 years prior to the Renaissance were a time of ignorance and intellectual repression in which vigorous debate and lively intellectual exchange did not occur, and that strict conformity was ruthlessly imposed on whatever scholarly community might be said to have existed. Even some professional authors can still be found giving credence to this view. In the course of some research, I came across a 2001 book called Second Messiah by Christopher Knight and Robert Lamas. These authors paint a picture of the Catholic Church and its influence on Western civilization that could not be more wrong. For example, we read, "Everything that was good and proper was despised, and all branches of human achievement were ignored in the name of Jesus Christ." Not mentioned by Knight and Lamas is that it was in the Dark Age. Not mentioned by Knight and Lamas is that it was in Dark Age Europe that the university system, a gift of Western civilization to the world, was developed by the Catholic Church. Historians have marveled at the extent to which intellectual debate in those universities was free and unfettered. The exaltation of human reason and its capabilities, a commitment to rigorous and rational debate, a promotion of intellectual inquiry and scholarly exchange, all sponsored by the Church, provided the framework for the scientific revolution, which was unique to Western civilization. One can scarcely find a significant endeavor in the advancement of civilization during early medieval ages in which the monks did not play a major role. As one study described it, the monks gave the whole of Europe a network of model factories, centers for breeding livestock, centers of scholarship, spiritual fervor, the art of living, readiness for social action. In a word, advanced civilization that had emerged from the chaotic waves of surrounding barbarity. Without any doubt, Saint Benedict was the father of Europe. The Benedictines, his children, were the fathers of European civilization. Chapter 2. A Light in the Darkness. The term Dark Ages was once applied to the entire millennium separating the period of late antiquity from the Renaissance. Nowadays there is widespread acknowledgement of the accomplishments of the High Middle Ages. As David Knowles points out, scholars have begun more and more to push the Dark Age designation back still further, excluding the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries from the dubious distinction. Still, there can be little doubt that the 6th and 7th centuries were marked by cultural and intellectual retrogression. In terms of education, literary output, and similar indicators. Was that the Church's fault? Historian Will Durant, an agnostic, defended the Church against this charge decades ago, placing blame for the decline not on the Church, which did everything it could to reverse it, but on the barbarian invasions of late antiquity. In the 8th century, the Church blessed the official transfer of power from the Merovingian dynasty to the Carolingian family, the family of Charles Martel, who had famously defeated the Muslims at Tours in 732, and ultimately of Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, who would become known as the Father of Europe. Under the influence of the Church, this barbarian people would be transformed into civilization builders. Perhaps the central intellectual figure of the Carolingian Renaissance was Alcuin, an Anglo-Saxon who had been educated at York by a pupil of the Venerable Bede, the great saint and ecclesiastical historian who was one of the greatest intellects of his day. Knowledge of Latin made possible both the study of the Latin Church Fathers and the classical world of ancient Rome. In fact, the oldest surviving copies of most ancient Roman literature date back to the 9th century, when Carolingian scholars rescued them from oblivion. Another achievement of the Carolingian Renaissance was an important innovation in writing known as Carolingian minuscule. Previously, geographical isolation had contributed to the growth of a variety of scripts throughout Western Europe, such that it eventually became difficult for people to decipher what their counterparts elsewhere were saying. The various scripts in use before the advent of the Carolingian minuscule were difficult to read and time-consuming to write. There were no lowercase letters, punctuation, or blank spaces between words. Although most educated people think of the medieval monasteries' scholarly and cultural pursuits as their contribution to Western civilization, we should not overlook the monks' important cultivation of what might be called the practical arts. Manual labor, expressly called for in the rule of Saint Benedict, played a central role in the monastic life. Although the rule was known for its moderation and its aversion to exaggerated penances, we often find the monks freely embracing work that was difficult and unattractive, since for them such tasks were channels of grace and opportunities for mortification of the flesh. This was certainly true in the clearing and reclaiming of land. Wherever they went, the monks introduced crops, industries, or production methods with which the people had not been previously familiar. According to the rule, all guests who come shall be received as though they were Christ. Chapter 5. The Church and Science. Oddly enough, it was a Marxist historian, Joseph Needham, who really got to the bottom of this failure. In his view, the culprit was the religious and philosophical framework in which Chinese thinkers operated. Such a conclusion is all the more stunning given Needham's Marxist ideology, which should have preferred some kind of economic or materialist explanation for the stillbirth of science in China. The Great Hunger, Ireland 1845 through 1849, by Cecil Woodham Smith. Chapter 1. At the beginning of the year 1845, the state of Ireland was, as it had been for nearly 700 years, a source of grave anxiety to England. Ireland had first been invaded in 1169. It was now 1845, yet she had been neither assimilated nor subdued. On January 1st, 1801, an event of enormous importance had taken place. The Act of Union between Ireland and England became operative. The two countries were made one. The economy of Ireland was assimilated into the economy of England. The Irish Parliament at Dublin disappeared, and the Parliament at Westminster henceforth legislated for both countries. At first sight, it seemed that Ireland had everything to gain. Free trade between Ireland and England meant that the discrimination hitherto practiced by England against Irish industry would come to an end. United with English riches, Ireland would gain the capital she desperately needed for development, while the 100 Irish members who were to sit at Westminster would give Ireland, for the first time, a voice in imperial affairs. Further, an impression had been created that when the Union became law, Catholic emancipation would immediately follow. The reality, however, was very different. The primary object of the Union was not to assist and improve Ireland, but to bring her more completely into subjection. 2 years earlier, in 1798, the Irish had rebelled. England at that moment was in extreme danger, passing through the darkest days of her struggle with revolutionary France, and the rebels of '98 were assisted by French troops and with French money. The rebellion was put down with savagery. The strength of the army in Ireland was increased to 100,000 men, and the Union followed. The hope of English investment proved a delusion. Free trade between the two countries enabled England to use Ireland as a market for surplus English goods. Irish industry collapsed. Unemployment was widespread. And Dublin, now that an Irish Parliament sat no longer in College Green, became a half-dead city. Above all, Catholic emancipation, expected to follow immediately on the Union, was only achieved after a desperate struggle in 1829. Ireland besought a repeal of the Union, and by 1843 the strength of the demand was seriously disquieting to the British government. The Catholic peasantry was becoming organized, the commercial classes were being drawn in, substantial sums of money were being raised. All this was the work of one man, Daniel O'Connell, who gave up a brilliant career at the bar to devote his life to Ireland. Self-government, not separation from England, was O'Connell's aim, and he cherished a romantic admiration for Queen Victoria, the darling little queen. He had a lawyer's respect for the law, with a horror of armed rebellion which derived from his personal recollection of the hangings, torturings, and floggings that had followed the '98. His followers were pledged to obtain repeal only by legal and constitutional means. Nevertheless, the repeal movement was felt by the government to be menacing. An Irish people united and controlled was an ominous spectacle, and the British government, seized with something near panic, began to prepare as if in hourly expectation of civil war. Troops were hastily brought from England, barracks were fortified and provisioned to withstand a siege. Justices of the peace who were repealers were dismissed, and in the courtyard of Dublin Castle a regiment of infantry was kept drawn up and under arms in readiness to suppress a revolt. Instead of proclaiming the meeting at once, nothing was done until the 11th hour on the Saturday afternoon before the Sunday. Then the guns of the Pigeon House, the fort commanding Dublin Bay, were trained on Clontarf. Warships entered Dublin Bay, and troops occupied the approaches to the meeting place when tens of thousands of people were massing. Had it not been for O'Connell's creed that human blood is no cement for the temple of liberty, a massacre might have taken place. But O'Connell ordered the people to go home, and, directed by his lieutenants, the vast multitude quietly dispersed. No monster meeting took place, no disturbance occurred. Nevertheless, O'Connell was arrested a week later on a charge of trying to alter the Constitution by force. Convicted by a packed jury, a partisan jury on which no Catholic or repealed was allowed to sit, he was sent to prison. The verdict was reversed by the House of Lords on September 24, 1844, and he was released. But for the movement, the psychological moment had passed. The iron of repeal had cooled, and O'Connell himself was a changed man. While in prison, he had lost his nerve. He was nearly 70, and the strain of the monster meetings, followed by arrest, trial, and imprisonment, even though he had been treated with consideration in prison, had broken his health. In the political division of Europe which followed the Reformation, England and Ireland were on opposing sides. Henceforward, Irish aspirations could only be fulfilled. Irish faith could only flourish. Through the defeat of England and the triumph of her enemies, freedom for Ireland meant Philip of Spain and the Inquisition in place of Elizabeth I. It meant James II instead of William III. It even meant, since misery and oppression make strange bedfellows, the victory of Napoleon. Freedom for the one meant slavery for the other. Victory for the one meant defeat for the other. The good of the one was the evil of the other. Ireland, resentful and hostile, lying only a day's sail in fine weather from British coasts, for centuries provided a refuge for enemy agents, a hatching ground for enemy plots. Her motto was, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity," and in every crisis of England's history she seized the moment of weakness to stab her enemy in the back. It is the explanation, if not the excuse, for the ferocity with which the English have treated Ireland. All this wretchedness and misery could, almost without exception, be traced to a single source, the system under which land had come to be occupied and owned in Ireland, a system produced by centuries of successive conquests, rebellions, confiscations, and punitive legislation. In 1843, in the midst of the repeal agitation, the British government, recognizing that the land was at the root of Irish discontent, set up a royal commission to inquire into the law and practice with regard to the occupation of land in Ireland. This commission, called the Devon Commission after its chairman, the Earl of Devon, visited every part of Ireland, examined 1,100 witnesses, printed 3 huge volumes of evidence, and reported in February 1845, a few months before the outbreak of the famine. Its secretary was an able and improving landlord, John Pitt Kennedy, who had gained some celebrity as the author of a pamphlet on the Irish questions entitled "Instruct, Employ, Don't Hang Them." It adds to the weight of its conclusions that the commission was a landlord's commission. Every member who sat on it was a landowner, and O'Connell declared, "It is perfectly one-sided, all landlords and no tenants." Under a practice known as tenant right, found mainly in Ulster. Compensation for improvements was paid, and where the practice existed, it was jealously guarded. The Devon Commission stated that the superior prosperity and tranquility of Ulster, compared with the rest of Ireland, were due to tenant right. A tenant of Lord Mountcashel's told the Devon Commission, "From the unbending integrity and honesty of Mr. Joy, we are considered as safe at will as under a lease. I have expended £500 without the scratch of a pen." He added, however, "But Lord Mountcashel may be gathered to his fathers, and Mr. Joy may die, and another Pharaoh may arise who knew not Joseph." Wretched though their condition might be, the pre-famine Irish peasants were not gloomy. "Their natural condition," wrote Sir Walter Scott during his visit to Ireland in 1825, "is turned towards gaiety and happiness," and the census commissioners noted the proverbial gaiety and lightheartedness of the peasant people. Dancing was the universal diversion, and Lord George Hill, who owned property in Dongle, was left an account of removing a cabin with dancing and fiddling. The custom on such occasions is for the person who has the work to be done to hire a fiddler, upon which engagement all the neighbors joyously assemble and carry in an incredibly short time the stones and timber upon their backs to the new site, men, women, and children alternately dancing and working while daylight lasts, at the termination of which they adjourn to some dwelling where they finish the night, often prolonging the dance to dawn of day. There was, however, a darker and more sinister side to the Irish character. They are said a land agent on the eve of the famine. They are, said a land agent on the eve of the famine, a very desperate people, with all this degree of courtesy, hospitality, and cleverness amongst them. To understand the Irish of the 19th century, and their blend of courage and evasiveness, tenacity and inertia, loyalty and double-dealing, it is necessary to go back to the penal laws. In broad outline, they borrowed Catholics from the army and navy, the law, commerce, and from every civic activity. No Catholic could vote, hold any office under the crown, or purchase land, and Catholic estates were dismembered by an enactment directing that at the death of a Catholic owner, his land was to be divided among all his sons, unless the eldest became a Protestant. When he would inherit the whole. Education was made almost impossible, since Catholics might not attend schools, nor keep schools, nor send their children to be educated abroad. The practice of the Catholic faith was prescribed, informing was encouraged as an honorable service, and priest hunting treated as a sport. In these conditions, suspicion of the law, of the ministers of the law, and of all established authority worked into the very nerves and blood of the Irish peasant. And since the law did not give him justice, he set up his own law. The secret societies which have been the curse of Ireland became widespread during the penal period, and a succession of underground associations, Oak Boys, White Boys, and Ribbon Ten, gathering in bogs and lonely glens, flouted the law and dispensed a people's justice in the terrible form of revenge. Nor were lawlessness, cruelty, and revenge the only consequences. During the long penal period, dissimulation became a moral necessity, and evasion of the law the duty of every God-fearing Catholic. To worship according to his faith, the Catholic must attend illegal meetings to protect his priest. He must be secret, cunning, and a concealer of the truth. The Constitution of the United States of America, and selected writings of the Founding Fathers. The Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the repository of their public records. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly, for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands. He has made judges dependent on his will alone, for the tenor of their offices, and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, and eat out their substance. He has affected to render the military independent of, and superior to, the civil power, for protecting them by mock trial, from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consequent consanguinity. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, declare that these united colonies are, and of right to be, free and independent states, and that, as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. On the resolution to put the Commonwealth into a state of defense, by Patrick Henry. Mr. President, no man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as abilities of the very worthy gentlemen who have just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights, and therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. Mr. President, it is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth, and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men, engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with those warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last arguments to which kings resort. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, may we indulge in the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know what course others may take, but as for me, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. The Story of the Church by Inez Smith Davis. Chapter 1, Background. Little more than a century ago, our church had its beginnings in the pioneer village of Palmyra in western New York. The history we have made in the succeeding years has been vivid, colorful, and distinctive. So much so that thousands of writers have piled up books, pamphlets, magazine articles, sermons, novels, stories, and plays in such number that it would take a library to hold them all. Zealous ministers of almost every other faith under the sun have added their rabid contributions and kindled many a fire, the acrid smoke of whose burning still obscures the clear facts of history. Peeved and disgruntled dissenters from our own ranks have occasionally added gossipy exposés, some of which have run into many undeserved editions, and eager but undiscriminating students have enriched the world with their scientific and psychological studies of Mormonism. No malicious people ever enthroned in their philosophy as their highest ideal the belief that God is love and that all men are brothers. Such a philosophy comes from the hearts of poets, enthusiasts, prophets, saints. To have missed the central faith and purpose of our belief is to have failed to know it at all, and the history of our church movement comprises at its core the more or less sporadic attempts of a people incapacitated by human stupidities, human fears and prejudices, but actuated by lofty aspirations and glorious dreams, to frame their convictions into a system that will eventually regenerate the souls of men. The people had passed through a war of 7 years' duration, and moral and religious decadence almost invariably follows war. A toppling over of the Episcopal Church in America was the natural result. The year 1783 marked the closing of the Revolution, and left the people drunk with the idea of liberty, a liberty which needed to be interpreted to be made usable in the formation of a new government. Throughout all our troubles, France had been our friend, or was so considered. The French Revolution found many partisans in the new republic. Everyone began to talk and write the new liberty jargon that was fashionable at the time. License, anarchy, infidelity were part of that jargon. Even as the French fashions the white cockade and the address of citizen, France was frankly atheistic. It is not at all strange that the most intelligent and tolerant men in a community made no profession of faith, for so many religious people were so narrow and fanatical that they would be intolerable to the people who profess to belong to the same denominations today. The most pious people in the beginning of the present century in the United States entertained a faith so unlike the belief of evangelical Christians as to almost create the impression that their religion was not the same religion we now have, and in which we now believe. There was no power in the written word, or for that matter in the spoken word, to produce a saving faith in anyone. Such faith, or regeneration as it was then called, was a gift from God, a miracle with which he transformed the hearts of his elect. Chapter 2. The Great Revival. A revival movement among a people who had previously shown such little interest in religion had indeed fostered assiduously an attitude of antipathy to it is one of the strangest chapters in American religious history. Perhaps stranger still was the fact that those most affected by the movement were in many cases the most unimaginative, phlegmatic, and common-sense backwoodsmen. In August 1801, Barton Stone introduced the movement into Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and held one of the most famous camp meetings of all time. Other Presbyterian ministers, McNamara, Thompson, Dunlavy, Marshall, David Purvegs, began to hold similar services, Says Stone that God required us to believe in his Son, and had given us sufficient evidence in his word to produce faith in us, if attended to by us. That sinners were capable of understanding and believing this testimony, and of acting upon it by coming to the Savior and obeying him, and from him obtaining salvation and the Holy Spirit. When we began first to preach these things, the people appeared as just awakened from the sleep of ages. They seemed to see for the first time that they were responsible beings, and that a refusal to use the means appointed was a damning sin. Chapter 12. The Church Moves West. At the conference in Fayette, January 2nd, 1831, the last general conference in New York, direction was given concerning the move to Ohio, and promise of a great endowment there was given. Kirtland had never been intended for more than a temporary stopping place for the saints in their pilgrimage west to the Zion that was to be built on the borders by the Lamanites. As the 5 men walked along, they talked over the gospel and made it a practice to read a chapter from the Bible and have a prayer every day. Arriving in what is now Kansas City, the party camped near the site of the historic Old Spring, which is now directly at the foot of the extension of Charlotte Street. Chapter 13. Pioneering in the West. Charles Joseph Latrobe was an Englishman traveling in America, and found much to amuse and entertain him in the manners of his partly civilized American cousins. He published his observations in the Rambler in North America. A young Negro took our horses with that affection of extreme politeness and good breeding which is so highly amusing in many of his color, and which inclines me to think that they appreciate the character of a fine gentleman more than any other part of the community. We were met by the settler with the frank, unceremonious bearing of his race. The meal which followed was plentiful and homely, and was dispatched first by the female and then by the male visitors, with the marvelous rapacity which is generally observable in the West. And as I sat apart waiting till our turn should come, I was much amused with the bustle of the scene. I watched the plates run the gauntlet from the table to the washing tub among a set of little Negroes of all shapes and sizes, who all strove to act as preliminary scorers, much to the disappointment of the dogs, who whined, whimpered, scratched, and pushed their sable competitors, and not less to the annoyance of the fat negress who acted as cook. These were the scenes which seemed to Eastern-bred Joseph Smith nearly a century behind the times. They depict the original settler as he appeared to his contemporaries. It is a common failing of the American people to place the pioneer upon a pedestal and worship there. The virtues of the father was always exceeded the virtues of the son. We always sigh for the good old days and the good old ways, which would prove intolerable to us if we could bring them back. Our grandsires are great and noble. It is a sacrilege to assign to them the commonplace sins and failings. Our grandmothers are universally virtuous, self-sacrificing, and industrious, possessing virtues we may never attain. The typical pioneer was of rough and ready type. Physical courage was inordinately admired. This attitude of the fighting Missourian was as inescapable to the staid New England Latter-day Saints as their tendency to reason things without the aid of fists was to the Missourian. To the majority of pioneers, there could be but one reason for not fighting out a quarrel, and that was cowardice. To the early Saints, Lyman White's tendency to refuse to turn the other cheek was a grievous fault. But perhaps all might have gone well in spite of so many differences in temperament, had it not been for slavery. The gentry of New York had slaves, a few even in Fayette, had a bond servant or two, but the keeping of slaves in large numbers was new to the Saints. They would have indignantly denied they were that hated thing known as an abolitionist. But at the same time, these Eastern people were Yankees. They owned no slaves, and in spite of denials, they were suspected of being abolitionists, whether they were or not. There was an attitude of almost fraternizing with the blacks, of treating them much as they treated white people, which was, to say the least, enough to make any slave owner distinctly uneasy. Chapter 14. Slavery in Missouri. To our so-called enlightened age, the economic system under which these people lived savored of barbarism. But conscientious and religious people held these opinions and made these laws. It is not at all improbable that 100 years from now our economic system will seem as antiquated and our political treaties as quaint as that of Governor Reynolds of Illinois as late as 1860. This man, who was possessed of enough culture, education, and popularity to become governor of the state of Illinois, wrote a rather remarkable pamphlet entitled Balm of Gilead, which he termed An Inquiry into the Right of Human Slavery. He compares the cohesion of the abolitionists to the religious organization of the Mormons, and the followers of John Brown are declared to be the same class as those in the French Revolution who fraternized on pipes and feasted on blood. His conclusion was that we of the United States at this day, with slavery, enjoy the most perfect and the most free government on earth, and I pray that it may be continued forever. Chapter 18. The Storm Breaks. Perhaps more than all else contributing to the mob of July 20th, 1833, in Independence, was the publication of an editorial, Free People of Color. In the Evening and the Morning Star of that month, a careful reading of this editorial at the present time shows nothing to give offense. But read with the bias of those days, in the spirit of those who are not of us are against us, one may see why people were so incensed by it. Actually, it was intended to pour oil on troubled waters by declaring the intention of the saints to observe strict neutrality on the slave issue. But to the Missourian of that day there was no neutrality. In many quarters the very basis of his civilization was being threatened. He intended to take no chances. And in spite of the efforts of the saints to move with caution, they were judged not by the words of their mouths, but by the thoughts of their minds and the feelings of their hearts. The Missourians instinctively felt an antagonism to the industrial system upon which their civilization was built, and seized upon this first public utterance to make it mean an invitation for free blacks to come and settle among them, and to be companions to their wives and children. But not all authorities are inclined to blame the riffraff of the town for the trouble. One writer, who calls himself an agnostic, writes in a sarcastic vein, "The lieutenant governor of the state, Lilburn W. Boggs, who witnessed this rare exhibition, exclaimed in a paroxysm exclaimed in a paroxysm of religious fervor and patriotic satisfaction, 'Mormons are the common enemies of mankind and ought to be destroyed. And you know what our Jackson boys can do. And you now know what our Jackson boys can do, and you must leave the country.' He definitely names George Simpson as the leader of the mob. The same writer gives Boggs, whether rightfully or not, the credit for a plan frequently followed in the next few years, that is, to gain possession of the arms of the saints and then attack them. Historical marker. Lindell Road, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods, has been known since its founding for its large stretches of unbroken forests and pine-covered mountains. The lands William Penn and Quaker settlers explored in the 1680s must have been an intimidating sight. In an era when most buildings were made from and heated with wood, trees were an extremely valuable resource, but an enormous amount of labor was required to cut, saw, and transport wood. In the colonial era, wood was usually a byproduct of the efforts to clear land for farming. This changed when Major James H. Perkins' Susquehanna Boom Company established a boom at Marker, Williamsport by 1851. A boom was a string of chained logs that spanned a river and caught logs that came from upstream. Companies branded their logs before floating to make sorting easier at the other end. Other technological innovations, the railroad and steam-powered sawmills, encouraged lumber entrepreneurs to descend on north-central Pennsylvania. Born in Fort Plains, New York in 1824, he experienced the hard work of farm life as a young man. After working briefly at a New York sawmill in 1844, Herdick decided to try his luck in Pennsylvania. By 1846, he and partner William Andrus owned shares in a shingle mill 9 miles north of Williamsport in Cogan House Township, Lycoming County. 3 years later, he bought a woodlot and sawmill of his own. In 1853, Herdick and his wife moved to Williamsport, where his career blossomed. His coming coincided with the arrival of a rail line in Williamsport, then home to less than 2,000 people. Herdick correctly sensed that a boom was around the corner and began buying up as much property as he could, including building lots, woodlots, and sites for sawmills. He also bought enormous tracts of timberland. At one point, he was the sole owner of 54,000 acres of timberland in Cameron, Clinton, Potter, Tioga, and Lycoming counties. In 1869, Herdick was elected mayor of the new city of Williamsport. At the same time, he owned the gas works and sold land to the railroads to bring them into the city. He built office buildings, a waterworks, an urban railway, and a bridge over the Susquehanna River. Herdick also owned the newspaper. The man who built the Millionaire's Row mansions was hurt badly in the 1873 financial panic. He never recovered and filed for bankruptcy. in 1878. Over the next 10 years, Herdick developed waterworks in Pennsylvania and Illinois. On March 2, 1888, he died after falling on ice and fracturing his skull. Herdick's death came a year before a catastrophic flood that hastened the decline of the lumber industry in the area. After the devastating flood, many mill owners did not rebuild because of the decreasing wood supply in the region. The center of the industry moved westward, as did future lumber giants Frederick Weyerhaeuser, William E. Dodge, and Harry McCormick. Progressives in the era of trust busting. In 1776, Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations that free market capitalism would bring prosperity In 1776, Adam Smith argued in The Wealth of Nations that free market capitalism would bring prosperity for all by finding new ways for workers to divide their labor. The Industrial Revolution utilized machines and methods of mass production that magnified this division of labor. By the end of the 19th century, this resulted in an explosion of competitive businesses in the United States. Adam Smith viewed wide-open competition as the driving force of the free market system. Competition, however, sometimes resulted in price wars, wasteful duplication of production, and bankruptcies. Profit-minded business leaders discovered that the way around the instability of competition was to dominate the market by creating cartels and bigger industrial organizations. Between 1897 and 1901, more than 2,000 mergers took place in the United States. This horizontal integration reduced the number of competitive companies in an industry. Defenders of corporate bigness claimed that the new supercorporations created jobs and efficiently produced and distributed goods and services at a lower cost. They further argued that property and contract rights permitted businesses to pursue their economic interests as they saw fit without government interference. This reflected the laissez-faire idea of capitalism. By 1880, John D. Rockefeller had merged about 100 independent oil refineries with his Standard Oil Company. He controlled about 90% of the U.S. oil business. In 1882, Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Trust. He set up a board of trustees to take control of all the stock from his many vertically and horizontally connected companies. By forming the Standard Oil Trust, Rockefeller was trying to hide that Standard Oil was a monopoly. Soon, corporate leaders in other industries such as railroads, cigarette making, and sugar refining organized their own trusts. The trusts speeded up mergers and eliminated competition among their members. As public criticism mounted during the 1880s, the American public called for government control over the powerful trusts. Reformers, called progressives, demanded that states pass antitrust laws to make cartels and monopolistic practices illegal and to regulate railroad rates. These laws, however, were ineffective because most trusts operated across state lines. Only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce. In 1890, Congress passed the first federal antitrust law, the Sherman Act. It outlawed every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. The Sherman Act also made it a crime to combine or conspire to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states. In 1895, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Sherman Act could regulate interstate sales and transportation. But the court said that the act could not ban the merger of manufacturing assets that established monopolies, even by companies operating in interstate commerce. The court reasoned that manufacturing was not part of the interstate commerce. In another case that year, the Supreme Court decided that the Sherman Act could bar union strikes that interfered with interstate commerce. Ironically, while Congress intended the Sherman Act to combat the big trusts, it was becoming a major weapon against organized labor. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president in September 1901. Roosevelt told Congress he opposed banning monopolies. Instead, he preferred that the federal government assume power of supervision and regulation over all corporations doing an interstate business. Despite his generally pro-business outlook, Roosevelt disliked the corruption and arrogance of the new class of super-rich. In 1902, public demands for trust-busting prompted him to file suit under the Sherman Act against the biggest railroad trust in the country. Northern Securities lost in the lower courts and appealed to the Supreme Court, claiming that the Sherman Act violated the freedom to make contracts. In 1904, in a stunning opinion for the court, Justice John Marshall Harlan declared that every combination that eliminates interstate competition was illegal. The Supreme Court majority found that all monopolies tended to restrain trade and to deprive the public of the advantages that flow from free competition. The court ordered the breakup of the Northern Securities Company into independent competitive railroads. Even so, by the end of his second term, Roosevelt remained convinced that the federal regulation of big business was the best way to tame the trusts. Filing lawsuits against individual monopolies to break them up was a costly and slow slog through the courts, he believed. Besides, he held the view that good monopolies benefited the public with efficient distribution of new products. Roosevelt accepted monopolies as an inevitable part of a modern economy. He proposed, however, a federal commission to regulate them by inspecting their accounting books and setting maximum prices on their products. He also wanted to impose rules for hours, wages, and working conditions. Roosevelt declared that the enslavement of the people by the great corporations can only be held in check through the expansion of governmental power. Wellington's Millions. Published May 10th, 2011 by Justin Ingle. Born August 26th. Fuck all that. Wellington's Millions by Justin Ingle. Born August 26th, 1831, in Pike Township, New York, Bert began his life as a farm boy. At 7, he stepped upon Michigan soil when his parents moved to Jackson County. By 22, his sense of adventure and curiosity sent him sailing aboard freighters and visiting Australia, South America, and the islands today known as Tasmania. He decided to settle down at age 26 when he returned to Michigan with plans to learn about the state's budding lumber industry. He found his way to mid-Michigan, where in 1857 he earned his first 13 monthly paycheck working as a woodsman at St. Louis Pine River Lumber Camp. The boss there liked the young man's drive, and after a month, Bert became a camp foreman and doubled his wage. The next year, with money saved, he sent out to build his own establishment in nearby Saginaw County. Bert eventually owned several mills, but the largest was known as Melbourne, named after his favorite Australian city. The camp featured a stave and heading mill, barrel factory, shingle mill, and companion salt block, carpenter and blacksmith shops, and a gas work station that provided lighting for the community's 45 houses, where woodsmen and their families lived. When traveling abroad, he employed his own press to report on his journeys for the daily newspapers. Much of his time was spent around camp, where Bert built places like Melbourne around family men, an effort that required adding a store, library, and school for the woodsman's children. He mainly hired married men because married men won't go on strike, Mudd said. Bert also tried his hand at politics. In 1867, East Saginaw elected him its 8th mayor, and later he became a state senator. He invested in the former C.S.M. Railroad that stretched from Durand to Bay County City, and, at one time, owned most of Ann Arbor railroad system. He invested abroad, buying up railways in Russia and China. Burt owned more than $300,000 in foreign bonds in Russia, China, Brazil, Nicaragua, Argentina, and Bolivia when he died. Records show. His wealth was so well known abroad that officials with Canada's Bank of Montreal turned to him for help when the institution teetered on the edge of failure. He obliged, loaning the bank $6 million. Burt, for a time, also was charitable to Saginaw, where he funded a municipal auditorium, a women's hospital, a Salvation Army, and a YWCA that later became downtown's Jacobson's. Vincent Kasuga and His Onions. Carl Smallwood. Vincent Kasuga was an unimposing 5-foot 4-inch tall onion farmer who had turned an unwanted 5,000-acre patch of dirt into a veritable onion-filled Garden of Eden. Kasuga had tried to trade wheat futures on the commodities market and screwed up so badly that he brought his family to the brink of bankruptcy. Kasuga's wife made him promise never to trade again after his failed trades resulted in them having to borrow money from a family friend just to stay afloat. Ignoring the pleas of his wife, Kasuga soon went back to trading. Only this time, instead of trading wheat, he stuck to what he knew and began trading onions. If you're curious about why onions were such a lucrative market, that has a lot to do with limited storability of onions, which are typically planted and harvested at very specific times during the year, which meant that for traders the price of onions had the potential to fluctuate wildly on a near day-to-day basis. For example, when the onions were harvested, they typically commanded a high price due to the fact the market had been virtually devoid of them for many months, and remaining stores of the previous crop were rapidly spoiling. However, this inevitably led to many farmers flooding the market with their harvest at the same time in a desperate attempt to get the best price, in turn dramatically lowering the price. The market for onions was so potentially lucrative that at one point in time, about 20% of all the trading that occurred in the Merc involved onions. Kasuga was buying onion futures MERC involved onions. Kasuga was buying onion futures in the hopes that the price would go up when that date arrived so that he could sell them for a profit. The thing is, as an onion farmer, Vincent held considerable sway over the market. One year, Kasuga desperately needed the price to go up to turn a profit. Kasuga bribed an official at the Chicago Weather Office to issue a severe frost warning. There was no such frost coming, but when this news leaked, people began panic buying onions, driving up the price and thus making Kasuga his money. In the autumn of 1955, after almost a year of frantic buying, Siegel and Kasuga owned 98% of the onions in Chicago. With literally the entire supply of onions under their control, the men were then able to artificially inflate the price of onions to about $2.75 a sack by severely restricting the supply. Because the men owned just about every onion in the city, they could guarantee that the price of onions would fall simply by flooding the market with the millions of onions they were holding in reserve as soon as the sales were final. By March of 1956, the price of onions fell so much that they effectively became worthless. The onions were now worth less than the sacks they were being sold in. Dozens of onion farmers went bankrupt, and millions of rotting and worthless onions ended up being dumped across the city. As for Kasuga and Siegel, they got away completely scot-free because they had technically not committed a crime. As a direct result of Kasuga's actions, though, the U.S. government enacted the Onion Futures Act in 1958, making it illegal to trade onion futures. He was a hugely respected and loved philanthropist almost his entire life, and the lion's share of the money he earned trading actually went straight to some charity or other. He was also well known for showering friends and family in lavish gifts. Kasuga was also a very devout Catholic, and he donated so much money to help fund the church's charitable activities that he was given a private audience with 3 different popes. To top it all off, Kasuga was so loved by his community that Pine Island voted him their Citizen of the Year in 1987. Commodity Futures Trading Commission CEA cases name: Vincent W. Kasuga, Sam S. Siegel, and National Produce Distributors, Inc. Order remanding proceeding to referee. This is a disciplinary proceeding under the Commodity Exchange Act. The respondents are charged with attempting to manipulate, and with manipulating, the prices of onions in interstate commerce and for future delivery on or subject to the rules of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Following presentation of the complainant's evidence at a hearing upon the complaint and answers, the referee issued a report on May 3, 1957, recommending that the complaint be dismissed and the proceeding terminated. The basis for the recommendation was the complainant's refusal to furnish to the respondents transcripts of sworn testimony given before the investigators of the Commodity Exchange Authority. In response to a subpoena duces tecum issued by the referee to the administrator, Commodity Exchange Authority, the complainant had offered to make the transcripts available to the referee for his examination and for disclosure by him of any materials in the investigatory transcripts which he considered of impeachment value to the respondents. The respondents rejected such proffer, and the refusal of the complainant to make the transcripts freely available to the respondents resulted in the referee's report recommending that the complaint be dismissed. The Constitution of the United States of America. Constitutional Liberty and Arbitrary Power by Joseph Warren. That man is formed for social life is an observation which, upon our first inquiry, presents itself immediately to our view, and our reason approves that wise and generous principle which actuated the first founders of civil government, an institution which hath its origins in the weakness of individuals, and hath for its end the strength and security of all. And so long as the means of effecting this important end are thoroughly known and religiously attended to, government is one of the richest blessings to mankind, and ought to be held in the highest veneration. In young and new-formed communities, the grand design of this institution is most generally understood, and the most strictly guarded. So long as this noble attachment to a constitution founded on free and benevolent principles, exists in full vigor in any state, that state must be flourishing and happy. It was this noble attachment to a free constitution which raised ancient Rome from the smallest beginnings to the bright summit of happiness and glory. And when this decayed, her magistrates lost their reverence for justice and the laws, forgetful of their dignity, and seduced by base corruption, betrayed their country, her soldiers, regardless of their relation to the community, and urged only by the hopes of plunder and rapine, unfeeling committed the most flagrant enormities, whereby the streets of Rome were drenched with her noblest blood. So hard was it to resolve to imbrue their hands in blood of their brethren, that they chose rather to quit their fair possessions and seek another habitation in a distant clime. When they came to this new world, which they fairly purchased of the Indian natives, the only rightful proprietors, they cultivated the then barren soil by their incessant labor, and defended their dear-bought possession with the fortitude of the Christian and the bravery of the hero. The British Constitution, of which ours is a copy, is a happy compound of three forms: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and without the consent of each branch, nothing can carry with it the force of a law. But when a law is to be passed for raising a tax, that law can originate only in the democratic branch. The reason is obvious. They and their constituents are to pay much the largest part of it, and as the monarch branch is supposed to have a just sense of his own interest, which is that of all the subjects in general, his consent is also necessary. First, I would ask whether the members of the British House of Commons are the democracy of this province. If they are either the people of this province or are elected by the people of this province to represent them. It is most certain they are neither, and therefore nothing done by them can be said to be done by the democratic branch of our Constitution. The power of the monarch branch we, with pleasure, acknowledge resides in the king, for it is plain that if there is any validity in those acts, it must arise altogether from the monarchical branch. For I do not conceive it to be of the least importance to us by whom our property is taken away, so long it is taken without our consent. And I am very much at a loss to know by what figure of rhetoric the inhabitants of this project can be called free subjects, how they can be said to have property, when a body of men whom they have not the least control, and who are not in any way accountable to them, shall oblige them to deliver up part or the whole of their substance without even asking their consent. And yet, whoever pretends that the late acts of the British Parliament for taxing America out to be deemed binding upon us, must admit at once that we are absolute slaves, and have no property of our own. It can be no matter of wonder that the people quickly perceived and seriously complained of the inroads which these acts must unavoidably make upon their liberty. As it was soon found, this taxation could not be supported by reason and argument. It seemed necessary that one act of oppression should be enforced by another, and therefore contrary to our just rights as possessing, or at least having a just title to possess, all the liberties and immunities of British subjects, a standing army was established among us in time of peace. Their baneful influence is most suddenly felt when they are placed in populous cities, for by a corruption of morals the public happiness is immediately affected, and that this is one of the effects of quartering troops in a populous city is a truth to which many a mourning parent, many a lost despairing child in this metropolis, must bear a very melancholy testimony. Soldiers are also taught to consider arms as the only arbiters by which every dispute is to be decided between contending states. They are instructed implicitly to obey their commanders without inquiring into the justice of the cause they are engaged to support. Language is too feeble to paint the emotion of our souls. When our streets were stained with the blood of our brethren, when our ears were wounded by the groans of the dying, and our eyes were tormented with the sight of the mangled bodies of the dead, the immediate actors in the tragedy of that night were surrendered to justice. It is not mine to say how far they were guilty. They have been tried by the country and acquitted of murder. What can be proposed by the repeated attacks made upon our freedom? I really cannot surmise, even leaving justice and humanity out of the question. I do not know one single advantage which can arise to the British nation from our being enslaved. I know not any of any gains which can be wrung from us by oppression, which they may not obtain from us by our own consent. But this, it seems, is too great a favor. We are to be governed by the absolute command of others. Our property is to be taken away without our consent. If we complain, our complaints are treated with contempt. If we assert our rights, that assertion is deemed insolence. If we humbly offer to submit the matter to the impartial decision of reason, the sword is judged the most proper argument to silence our murmurs. You have, my friends and countrymen, frustrated the designs of your enemies by your unanimity and fortitude. It was your union and determined spirit which expelled those troops who polluted your streets with innocent blood. None but they who set a just value upon the blessings of liberty are worthy to enjoy her. Your illustrious fathers were her zealous votaries. They brought her safe over the rough ocean, and fixed her seat in this then dreary wilderness. You surely cannot, with such examples before your eyes, as every page of the history of this country affords, suffer your liberties to be ravished from you by lawless force, or cajoled away by flattery and fraud. The voice of your father's blood cries to you from the ground, my sons, scorn to be slaves. Follow not the dictates of passion, but enlist yourselves under the sacred banner of reason. Use every method in your power to secure your rights. At least prevent the curses of posterity from being heaped upon your memories. If you, from your souls, despise the most gaudy dress that slavery can wear, if you really prefer the lonely cottage to gilded palaces, surrounded by the ensigns of slavery, you may have the fullest assurances that tyranny, with her whole accursed train, will hide their hideous heads in confusion, shame, and despair. May we ever be a people favored of God. May our land be a land of liberty, the seat of virtue, the asylum of the oppressed, until the last shock of time shall bury the empires of the world. Fucking Christ, Mother Mary, and all the goddamn shitting saints. Why? Just fucking why? I fucking hate all the quotation. My deepest apologies. Or at least I would offer it if I wasn't just lying to myself at the onset of this project that I wouldn't do this very thing. Hell, there ain't none of you left to apologize to, or, more likely, you've perhaps tried to skip all that boring-ass history written by long-winded, cocky shit-sucking pigs, and may drop in later on. I'm getting antagonistic. Need to back off and write coherently. Fuck. So, obviously I tossed the initial layout off the London Tower. I had probably 30 other sources I had just skimmed and thought of throwing in to help reiterate points I would then lay out in the upcoming chapters. I had mentioned at the start of this madness of a second chapter. If it wasn't clear, I had intended to lay out examples that I didn't hear about quite as often, that related to our progression in the overarching topics of agriculture, infrastructure, and the civil institutions developed to refine such progression, even to allowing the creation of perhaps more frivolous pursuits organizations. Also, it wasn't technically going to be a chronological summary, but one that led, keep calm, through the insane, terrible, yet amazing acts of all these countries that take the historic pretense to fuck each other over, or their own people. Having trouble as if there is anything I am pissed or actually sorry over, it's not doing all of humanity its justice in recalling such a summary. I tried to sprinkle what I could. How you take it is your own thought process. As for mine, well, I threw that China quote by the author of the illuminating piece on the Catholic Church just being the greatest and most oppressed thing on the planet. Breathe. What kind of retarded ass take is that, though? He didn't even fucking quote the motherfucking source with proper context. Chopping, screwing shit to move on. I'll just say that's why I gave such large quotations. I grew up in a Christian household, and so much of the disagreements I saw tearing these communities apart seemed due to the desire of humans to do this very thing. Hyperfocus. Get back to the subject, Chris. I'm sure you guessed by all the attention paid to European history, I'm that arrogant ass cisgender single white American male with probably damn near all Northern European blood. You know, recent events could almost make an atheist like myself question their resolve against spiritual influences. I look at the pain and anguish I see my generation fall into logical fallacies in the pursuit of hope, and I think to myself, how easy it could have been to fall down those same roads, to desire these same outcomes. It's why, after I had laid my groundwork for all the other countries, I would turn to what I had tried to make my forte, U.S. history. Instead, you got that fucking nonsense. Phew. I was the typical angsty teen, but my love of reading helped fuel my hate during this time. This was when I started to discover more of my country's claims to infamy, like the lobbying of lumber barons to crush hemp in the 1930s, the Tulsa Massacre, the Japanese internment camps, the bodies of Chinese immigrants that lay underneath the railways, how we bombed our own city, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania no less, sacrificing our mentally impaired to pseudoscientists like old Walter Freeman. Hell, even the stupid-ass Civil War states' rights spiel, a fucking states' right to tell other human beings they have no freedom, being the actual reality. Oh yeah, we're fucking going down that Darks and Dusty's roads, eventually. I played out all the hate cycle, conspiracy theorist, violence is the only answer, bull hockey, still have trouble shaking the tinfoil hat off to this day. Needless to say, I was screaming about the Chinese government's potential power growth in 2009 and got over it by 2015. Too much other equally horrific history being made to play arbiter of who's the most villainous. For instance, it seems impossible to have a civilized conversation about the questions of 9/11 without damn near starting a brawl. I don't buy daddy government's bullshit on World Trade Center Tower 7, You know, the one that never got hit but lay in literally just as much fucking rubble as the two that got creamed with Boeing 767s. I mean, for fuck's sake, literally fuck. No. We're only a little halfway through this journey. I can't jump the shark yet. Just yet. I will say this. No, it's not the fucking Jews. And I've got a wonderful surprise at the end of this book, especially for those that like to just skip to the end and read the last page. For those readers, listeners that endure this, probably to be judged some sick manifesto, I hope you can sift through the salaciousness to some degree as to minimize any perturbed feelings. With that being said, time to try and salvage what's left of this loving headache. Summary of the subjects as stated in the beginning, up to and including the epilogue, with other bullshit. You know, back when I first conceived this work, it was during the brief stint of college I did at Benedictine in Atchison, Kansas. It was a wildly different concept back then as well. I previously stated that I'd begun to seek out texts of philosophy and theology as I hoped to understand what I believe instead of being told my thoughts. While I imagine 2 of those sentences may have you scoffing, it was here I was able to engage in honest discussion with a devout Catholic theology teacher who, being the human being he was, treated me as more an equal than a superior, despite his superior length of study. My conversations with him began to give rise to the idea of agency, or humanity's ability to choose as I saw it, negating the very concept of an eternal, omnipotent, omniscient being, or the intelligent designer. Despite how this concept would alter, or more accurately, be rebuilt, the subject has stuck with me even through a multiverse consisting of such an individual quickly disrupts the main argument. Distractions. I went forward trying to understand what made this topic so essential to me. I came to the decision that it was due to my peers, or those who claimed some fashion or form of atheism as well. I despise most of you almost as much as religious zealots. After leaving a religious private school where I was almost the only open atheist in attendance, all I saw was human beings doing the exact same shit I hated so much about what I felt was my distaste with Christianity. What was the point of acting like assholes if you're so goddamn sure you're correct? Richard Dawkins was one of the worst offenders. This fucking douchebag was all the rage of those supposedly of similar thought to me, and all he contributed was telling atheists to act like Bible-thumping Christians instead of opening the goddamn thing and using knowledge from it to show the error in their behaviors. I seemingly lived in an era long detached from some of the great atheist thinkers. Hell, men like Friedrich Nietzsche, Immanuel Kant, weren't even true atheists, at least as I think of it. But they did more for the belief I hold as one than anyone I've read in the years concurrent to my lifespan. The whole purpose almost seemed to be the eradication of faith through humiliation. What I see as incredibly akin to being some form of wounded individual and led to believing in a purpose. There was no comprehension, no study or pursuit to exchange controversial opinions to achieve knowledge. Every niche group had a line in the sand, a message from the wilderness, an ideal so wholly leaned upon that its belief was tantamount to reality, and the questioning of it was an affront to common sense. Just fucking writing that word fills me with the desire to amputate the offending fingers, or maybe go desecrate the grave of Thomas Paine. I'm not ready for that rabbit hole yet. Obviously, getting worked up because of what I really want to get to, which is why I think our whole environment and its workings devolved the way it did. That is, of course, if it really devolved in any meaningful way to begin with. Good old competition. Gotta love it, right? Drives human innovation, provides excitement to our extracurricular activities, energizes the heart and body when pitted in proving one's skill against another of almost equal or greater merit, shows strengths and weaknesses through trial and tribulation of individual methods to accomplish a similar task, cares only for the most effective, efficient actions leading to the accomplishment of a specific criteria. Right? I'm sure there are just oh so many examples to prove me wrong, but take your argument up with your bank account. Money is what I desire to target, despite the whole competition shtick being older still. Money has contributed so much to all those grand designs that seem to enable humanity to break through barrier after barrier of culture, art, and foundationally intellect. To expound, when I speak of money here, I use my basic understanding of it as a medium to equate products and services for facilitating fair trade. No need to get triggered, as much as my teenage self-identified Marxist part would love such a critique as heartless and or prone to injustice. I would just be lying to myself now. I'm well aware that the ideology of capitalism far predates my country, and my critiques of it could easily be dismissed by the same reasoning used in my apologetics for Marxism, communism, socialism. The mistakes, issues, atrocities attributed to supposed communist governments are not the faults of the principles that compromise the promised system, but the human beings bearing its icon's failure to embody the hope at the heart of the symbol. Again, I don't mean something so basic as the errors we inevitably make as humans, but the desire to shy away from these incidents, which can become more tantalizing the more responsibility the individual has, usually translating into a larger fallout from mistakes. Chris. Oi. Once again being vague and rambling. Let's get back on target. So money makes the world go round, I believe is the cliche. Kind of funny one at that, if you ask me. Based on the view I laid out from my perspective, how could something so basic be so potent? Unfortunately, it doesn't take much imagination or critical thought before the spider's web of realized potential comes into focus. Before governments, armies, cities, or probably significant communities, humans assuredly had to think of ways to gather what items they thought necessary or desirable. Rather than being limited to an individual's capabilities, having excess food, crafted materials, or unique objects could assist with retrieving the wants, needs held by the other. For the sake of some silly shit, let's say you got 100 pounds of corn, and you meet a shepherd willing to trade you 2 sheep for your corn. Pleased to have an animal for wool and meat, you take one of your newly acquired sheep to the metalsmith, who every year repairs your hoe for 50 pounds of corn in preparation for the next season. Problem is, he says it will be 4 sheep to pay for the service. You can't spare any more of your corn reserves, and you only have 2 sheep. Let's add money to the mix. The farmer gives a merchant his corn for its equal 100 coins. Farmer buys 1 sheep for 50 and the services of the blacksmith for the remainder. The two can now use their coin to borrow. The two can now use their coin to buy corn from the merchant. This is a super basic ass example, but hey, every innovation seems to start somewhere before we improve it. I'm sure every one of these socialists just went, ha, there it is, the problem with capitalism. A merchant under my example would have to be a government agent of some capacity, as there is no compensation for his part in the transaction. Without access to alternative resources, the merchant is now at square one with no goods and 100 coins. And even if he has such capability, what service puts coin back into the merchant's pocket to trade with the farmer again or even sustain the merchant's livelihood? Hence why even Roman senators were romanticizing capitalist progression fucking 2 millennia ago. I mean, all that those high-minded, learned fellows needed was the assets to create for us their wonderful utopia. You know, alongside our obedience. I mean, cooperation, of course. I fucking suck. Yeah, I fucking know that verb lacks a predicate. You know, I fucking hate Saul. Bigoted ass son of a bitch Roman soldier. But he nailed it when he wrote the love of money was the root of all evil. Fuck. Even that, though. Because it was just rephrasing what he presumed Christ's words meant. And now I'm assuming shit. The basic ass example gives us at least 2 quick options for our merchant. They can operate as a government agent, having their needs met, and act as the institution's price goods exchange. They could also be a free agent, having to exchange goods at a profit to themselves to cover their expenses. While both theoretically work, one obviously gives the merchant more freedom in the conduct of his business. Does it really matter who does the squeezing when pressure is put on the consumer to accept their goods being traded at a value they know will not sustain them? Swinging wild. Yes, I believe any group being handed so much power as to dictate the price of commodities can be just as unbalanced as individuals through some method holding the same claim. Some seem to have understood that no matter how good the intentions, a monopoly is as devastating as a natural disaster. The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise. Tacitus. Neither Russia, nor Germany, nor any other great power has the right to claim that it is waging a war of defense. All the great powers are waging an imperialist, capitalist war, a predatory war, a war for the oppression of small and foreign nations, a war for the sake of the profits of the capitalists, who are coining golden profits amounting to billions out of the appalling suffering of the masses. Vladimir Lenin, speech at Bern, February 8, 1916. The East India Company helped kill off India's once robust textile industries, pushing more and more people into agriculture. This, in turn, made the Indian economy much more dependent on the whims of seasonal monsoons. In the mid-19th century, it was common economic wisdom that government intervention in famines was unnecessary and even harmful. Viewpoint: How British Let 1 Million Indians Die in Famine, by Binyar Patel, June 11th, 2016. Honestly, they never even come close to the word monopoly. But in my mind, the simplest characteristics of what makes a monopoly fits very nicely into all these quotes. Is it not good business to direct the ventures of such toward a profitable future? Even when risks are taken in hopes of progression, is caution thrown completely to the wind with no care to understanding all that is available before acting? Boy howdy, there definitely seem to be good examples of the answer being no. Take charities. These are businesses. They have employees, management, accountants, advertisements, and a myriad of codes, practices to assist their operation. So many have proven themselves aligned to some of the worst offenders of questionable economics while simultaneously promoting health, safety, and or prosperity. While I began to set my agency paper on the back burner of my brain, Esteros and Yalohila Esteros and Yalahila showed me a wealth of information I may never have found myself. I tend to be stuck in the past across so much of my thinking, and I believe they got a serious kick out of knowing a conservative that didn't see themselves as such. I rarely change, but I do seek knowledge and comprehension which facilitates change, even if it's only a change of speech to better represent what I ascribe to, what actions I want to take. The Young Turks were one such source of information with a far different format than from what I found detestable in the major networks. Yalohila was probably one of their original viewers. Being millennials, we had differing degrees, avenues of political interest. But Esteros was almost certainly the most liberal of us three, I would say. The Young Turks were trying to jumpstart the progressive movement in some fashion when I started to listen on YouTube somewhere between 2009 to 2012. I was firmly a Marxist in my mind during this time. Both parties were completely unsalvageable, as both suffered from the problem with the entire system as a whole. And TYT seemed to be one of the few news outlets kinda touching on it. The pursuit of economic stability, nay success, filled me with disgust and, coupled with an overbearing conservative upbringing, led me to foolishly get caught up under the powerful lies then President-elect Barack Obama spouted to set himself apart from Hillary Clinton in the primary and John McCain in the general. Still, I should be thankful. Obama bailing out the automotive industry marked the last time I would consciously be so enamored with another human being to trust the words of them without any thought to examine their prior actions. With another human being to trust the words of them without any thought to examine their prior actions. If I were a better person at the time, I would have just written your name on the general ballot, Bernie. Anna Kasparian and Cenk Uygur caught my ear and held it through their critique of the then president who shared their party. While still Democrats, they laid into him over the same issues I was harping on about. Like a breath of fresh air in a cramped, loaded porta-potty, I quickly tried inhaling a majority of their content, and while we disagreed on many issues, I trusted them to give context, the holy grail of news in my mind. Its absence a large contributor to my rejection of most traditional journalism. I did not want both sides' bullshit or questions as a response, nor did I appreciate the focus that was paid to choices characteristics of a personal freedom nature. What I wanted was for those delivering the quotes of others to relay those quotes in fullness, not dissected to prop up the truth they hold of the events' intentions on whom they reported. Cenk and Anna seemed to hit these points in spades during this time, easily eviscerating the ridiculous attacks hurled at Obama by other organizations, while shouting into the ether about his policies' detrimental impacts on average Americans both present and future. Alas, as to whether they changed or I did is totally up for debate. I could feel myself, whatever emotion I allowed, of course, breaking as more and more I shouted at the screen, not in agreement, but anger. Many of my early disagreements with their reporting boiled down to semantics, basically. While I seemed to think we both saw the problem, we had totally opposing We had two totally opposing beliefs as to how it should be solved, but I enjoyed the controversy. Know thine enemy, I believe, is the idiom, which is a day-to-day struggle if you know nothing. I would ramble on, usually to myself, but occasionally to Yalohila and Estros, but where the consequences of the TYT's propositions would lead, obviously from a historical precedent. Trouble is, whatever my counter retort was, ended up Trouble is, whatever my counter retort was, ended up going down similar or the same fucking routes I had goddamn put on their options, usually leading to me throwing up my hands and saying, I don't fucking know, but I know it ain't that way. That was until, like so many of my favorite musicians, I realized my opinion was just my own. We shared nothing but our humanity. So much good and anguish came from the wild goose chases you guys would send me on. Researching so much more of our nation's history than I would have ever cared for with my base knowledge, despite my then complete reversal on what I thought of America. You worried me with your defenses of capitalism and authentic free markets, which maybe makes me the fool. Maybe the speech was always there, and I just agreed too heavily to listen. I said a reversal of my thoughts on my country due to what I said in the beginning on believing as a child this country had set the world's wrongs right. My adoption of the moniker Marxist was me acting upon the realization of how this country was a facade. Like a mass of angry humans raising the hue and cry, the true movements of the country as a whole would only blazon under passionate ideals guided by men of wisdom and wealth, who swore to us better futures, sang loud to the heavens with verses of peace, justice, posterity. Of course, a look longer than the blink of an eye tells me that even before this country was even fully formed, these lofty hopes, aspirations of liberty, were actively being undermined by the same men who dared utter its temptations. Yea for me, but nay for thee. Looking at you, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and so fucking many others. But that's what humans do, isn't it? Without an example to promote action alongside their flowery litanies, it feels almost predestined that this country would certainly follow in the same footsteps all great nations prior had tread. Capitalists, merchants, titans of economy, industry, the names I mentioned previously were this and more, desperate to spread their influence, manage a fledgling government into righteousness, preserve this new nation's wealth that the Spaniards, French, and English were so vehemently fixated upon. The Constitution forged from such men could only fall short of living up to the standards brandied about so casually, stoking the hearts of the masses into merely swapping their yokes. Men so enlightened giving us renowned vocabulary on the details of what invited the evils of tyranny to rot the core tenets of a nation's good and just principles would not dare refuse themselves the potential for the same right when the time came to put down the law with pen to paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everyone living in the same country as I should recognize that line, and I think some clarity shit got lost along the way. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors out of Negroes. nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. There is a physical difference between the white and black races. While they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln versus Douglas, Fourth Debate, September 18th, 1858. Go ahead and get more of the context on that one. Just like all his fucking ilk, he had some serious blind spots relative to the quotation. Unnecessary assumptions from me out of spite. I do give old honest Abe the benefit of the doubt. While I find it hard to say he was not a complete bigot, I imagine he knew, like a lawyer would, that an outright demand for the equality of all human beings could literally be political suicide. Certainly not going to do yourself any economic favors in the eyes of individuals, families, who are being told their very way of life is at stake with such an upheaval. I don't just empathize with the Southern strategy. I believe it wholeheartedly. In my opinion, the way things have trended over the last 150 plus years, the North's goal was to make all men slaves to the government, and more importantly, as with all governments, give a helping hand to the institutions, humans that are favored by these same individuals that are charged with managing the lives of whom should truly be at the forefront of their legislative thoughts, their bosses, the people, all people, aka what a government is, in my opinion. I do think Lincoln wanted something different than what he began. Those who are convinced of their own lies make better populists. They're just dangerous once they have the authority to institute real change, especially when they're forced to grow a backbone in order to successfully crush an enemy. Here, let me help you see that Lincoln was just another brick in the road back towards totalitarianism while causing you to cry inside some more. Early industrialization in the Northeast. During the 17th and 18th centuries, artisans, skilled, experienced craft workers, produced goods by hand. An apprenticeship would be followed by work as a journeyman. After sufficient time as a journeyman, a shoemaker could at last set up his own shop as a master artisan. Merchants in the Northeast and elsewhere turned their attention as never before to the benefits of using unskilled wage labor to make a greater profit by reducing labor costs. This process proved attractive because it whittled production costs. The families who participated in the putting out system were not skilled artisans. They had not spent years learning and perfecting their craft and did not have ambitious journeymen to pay. Therefore, they could not demand, and did not receive, high wages. Most of the year they tended fields and orchards, ate the food that they produced, and sold the surplus. Putting out work proved a welcome source of extra income for New England farm families who saw their profits dwindle from new competition from Midwest farms with higher yield lands. Some skilled British mechanics, including Samuel Slater, managed to travel to the United States in the hopes of profiting from their knowledge and experience. Slater convinced several American merchants, including the wealthy Providence industrialist Moses Brown, to finance and build a water-powered cotton mill on the British models. The embargo of 1807 and the War of 1812 played a pivotal role in spurring industrial development in the United States. Jefferson's embargo prevented American merchants from engaging in the Atlantic trade, severely cutting into their profits. The War of 1812 further compounded the financial woes of American merchants. The acute economic problems led some New England merchants, including Francis Cabot Lowell, to cast their gaze on manufacturing. In 1813, Lowell and these wealthy investors, known as the Boston Associates, created the Boston Manufacturing Company. Together they raised $400,000. And in 1814, established a textile mill in Waltham and a second one in the same town shortly thereafter. The Boston Associates mills, which employed hundreds of workers, were located in company towns, where the factories and worker housing were owned by a single company. This gave the owners and their agents control over their workers. The competition New England farmers faced from farmers now settling in the West, and the growing scarcity of land in population-dense New England, had important implications for farmers' children. Realizing their chances of inheriting a large farm or receiving a substantial dowry were remote, these teenagers sought other employment opportunities, often at the urging of their parents. In the 1830s, the French government sent engineer and economist Michael Chevalier Michael Michael Michel Chevalier Michel Chevalier to study industrial and financial affairs in Mexico and the United States. In 1839, he published Society, Manners, and Politics in the United States. Chevalier describes the rules and wages of the Lawrence Company in 1833. All persons employed by the company must devote themselves assiduously to their duty during working hours. They must be capable of doing the work which they undertake, or use all their efforts to this effect. They must on all occasions, both in their words and in their actions, show that they are penetrated by a laudable love of temperance and virtue, and animated by a sense of their moral and social obligations. The agent of the company shall endeavor to set to all a good example in this respect. Every individual who shall be notoriously dissolute, idle, dishonest, or intemperate, who shall be in the practice of absenting himself from divine service, or shall violate the Sabbath, or shall be addicted to gaming, shall be dismissed from the service of the company. All ardent spirits are banished from the company's grounds, except when prescribed by a physician. All games of hazard and cards are prohibited within their limits and in the boarding houses. The Timber and Stone Culture Act. Congress established the Timber and Stone Culture Act of 1878 on June 3rd. The law was part of a large-scale effort to help populate the West. The TSCA promoted the sale of land in the 4 states or territories of California, Oregon, Nevada, and in Washington. Goals of the TSCA were to help the Western population growth and to meet the demands of independent lumbermen. The land covered under the TSCA was unfit for farming, but deemed fit for foresting and mining. The quality of the land allowed the government to sell said land for $2.50 per acre. Though the price of the land was very low, the government put a purchasing limit of 160-acre blocks of land to any one person, family, or small company. Furthermore, only one person in said groups could have ownership of TSCA land. In the oath of a settlement, or own benefit stipulation, in the TSCA was purposely added to prevent any larger company from hiring people to buy land and then transferring the deed to said company. In the same year of the signing of the TSCA, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the government could not enforce restrictions on citizens' rights to sell purchased land. With the ruling by the Supreme Court, large lumber companies began to acquire land rights from settlers. In some cases, sailors were paid to buy land and transfer ownership right after purchasing it. An estimate places the total amount of sold TSA forest land at over 13 million acres. Maine peonage law sent men to jail for quitting their jobs. In 1907, lumber barons persuaded politicians to pass the Maine peonage law to keep lumberjacks on the job. Maine lawmakers copied from an Alabama law designed to tie workers to their employers. Maine lawmakers copied from an okay, just start from the beginning. In 1907, lumber barons persuaded politicians to pass the Maine peonage law to keep lumberjacks on the job. Maine lawmakers copied from an Alabama law designed to tie workers to their employers. They, employers, put them into debt, and the government put them in jail if they didn't work it off. Historian Charles Scontras concluded 342 men went to jail after employers tricked them into accepting lumber work they couldn't do, or employment brokers loaned train fare and dumped miles from the camps, or the company store gave them credit to buy overpriced boots and clothes and other necessities. Under its provisions, hundreds of men have been convicted and forced to serve a sentence in jail for no offense other than being in debt, the report said. The Labor Commission also criticized judges who are anxious to make the sentence satisfactory to the influential lumbermen operating in the vicinity. The lumbermen's reaction to the Labor Commissioner's report was swift, sure, and anonymous. The newspaper quoted them, calling the report a false alarm. The lumber barons claimed only a half-dozen men had been prosecuted. They complained the crews were made up of foreigners and the scum of Boston, most of whom were unfit for hard work. They complained the men were taken into the woods at much expense and after working 2 or 3 weeks have left. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. I'll just read it out. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. Morton. The adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution extended civil and legal protections to former slaves and prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In its effort to contract such use of violence and intimidation, Congress passed the Enforcement Act of May 1870, which prohibited groups of people from banding together or to go in disguise upon the public highways or upon the premises of another with the intention of violating citizens' constitutional rights. The Second Force Act, which became law in February 1871, placed administration of national elections under the control of the federal government and empowered federal judges and United States Marshals to supervise local polling places. The Third Force Act, dated April 1871, empowered the President to use the armed forces to combat those who conspired to deny equal protection of the laws and to suspend habeas corpus, if necessary, to enforce the act. I mean, are we really pretending these fucking Northern Puritan fanatical misers really believed in freedom, liberty, unalienable rights? Berate my poor interpretations at your will, but I am right there with you small government Southerners, except I'm here alone. What the fuck is this shit? The mastermind of the so-called Republican Party, Senator Seward, has in a recent speech at the purpose of his party to dislodge the democracy from the position of the federal government, and assigns as a reason the friendship of that party for what he denominates the slave system. He declares the union between the states having slave labor and free labor to be incompatible, and announces that one or the other must disappear. Speech of Jefferson Davis before the Mississippi Legislature, November 16, 1858. And that motherfucker Seward was goddamn right. How in the same speech are you gonna argue that slavery is a just system while pleading for the recognition of individual freedom and liberty? Of course, that's exactly why an argument can't be made in the same fashion I pose it. Rather than conversing with the North to truly supplement the vast economic changes that such an upheaval of traditional management would require, it was far more profitable for the wealthy of both sides to force one to submit to the other's word structure. Davis and his peers couldn't truly desire to see a free America when they profited from what was foundationally the same evil as his enemies in the North. The only difference is the South wanted to keep an entire people as non-human to preserve their constituents' faithfulness, and the North just said everybody gets rights, so long as you meet A through Z criteria, that we get to set at whim with the power of a federal government. It's why there's just a plethora of flowery rhetoric. They all screech about our duty to goodness, morality, justice, godliness, independence, etc., only to skip the details about how obedience in our actions for them translates to such aspirational realities. Get a bunch of fucking nonsensical, faith-based, unrelated ad hoc word games. I am not one to call out contradictions lightly, as I firmly ascribe to a duality of man view. But freedom and power are direct opposites. Humans as a whole aren't free so long as any form of power actually exists. Though, like, how does that even work when shit like freedom and power don't fucking exist to begin with? And I'm getting ahead of myself again. My aunt called me a contrarian recently, and it gave me serious pause. While I do have a nigh muscle memory reaction to disagree with any ultimatum judgment on the state of things, I have always considered it to be from a place of general disagreement on the processes used to lay out said fact-based statement. I had to stop and reevaluate my own motives, shut the fuck up, and dive down the rabbit hole of what I actually believe once again. It's hard to completely disagree with such an assessment when you've seemingly sought to defend anything other than the assessments of popular society. Music, movies, art, books, politics, religion, hell, even our criminal justice system. I love to play devil's advocate, no matter the stance being held by the other I'm engaged with. It's unfortunate I find such a stance incredibly easy to take. All I need to do is think about the relation the subject has to wealth. Once I have figured out which parties are trying to play power top in my mind, I'm done with the process. There is no convincing me that the method being discussed should be implemented, even if the overall conclusion is a statement I too hold to be true. Our country has helped apply a dollar symbol to everything across our globe. I've held a deep empathy for felons, convicts, prisoners, whatever term you like for those prosecuted by a judicial system. I think I took too much to heart the teachings of my youth, and when working at V's Italiano Ristorante, I got a first-hand look at the riffraff that in reality are just less fortunate due to how the world spins. Some of my friends were former murderers, thieves, arsonists, mostly addicts, drug dealers, though I wouldn't be surprised if chomos, and rapists were amongst them too. Despite all this, I say there was no difference between them and individuals never caught, prosecuted. My former co-workers formed bonds with those they toiled beside, told their jokes and shared their rude, simplistic stereotypes, had goals, desires, tribulations, dread, pet peeves, etc., and etc., because they were just human beings like everybody else. My irritation at the narratives told around those found guilty of whatever continued to reach new heights, as the options I heard were they suffer too much, and our legal system is rigged, or they get exactly what they deserve, no matter the penalty, so long as torture isn't involved. I didn't even bother going into semantics with peers on this subject at the time, due to trying to show both statements were false and true simultaneously was like trying to look left and right at the same time. TYT finally helped bring some clarity to my thoughts. It was the money. Once again, the issue I had not anticipated was the subject that was seemingly just the way of things. One of the worst, best ideologies TYT helped me weaponize was the belief of true equal justice. The human beings with the least to lose were the easiest to oppress through every means possible, as they deserve it, right? Totally sounds like blind justice to me. Regardless, it seemed the stigma of conviction carried a heavy burden. TYT and their affiliates confirmed the actions being taken against the demographic with information regarding prison labor, guard shortages, exploitation, the continual privatization of prisons, and the effects of turning an institution charged with rehabilitation guardianship towards one of cutting unnecessary costs, if not net gain. Hilarious as even an affront to freedom warranting rebellion was supposedly imprisonment over debts, and yet it's been with us since the birth of this country. I had a heavily enforced teaching about laws and their purpose growing up, but lies are what it boiled down to. There was no natural moral law, there was only instinct. A natural law, like gravity for instance, is something that forces your actions to comply. You will not continuously fly upwards just by jumping. The action of the force cannot be avoided with what we as humans are at base equipped with. Being good or bad cannot fit that description. Whoa, slow your crazy train of thoughts. When I began to pit the actions of our society against its words, more contradictions than the Bible showed up. The pursuit of this knowledge originated from what was the economic crash of 2008, where I started finally realizing what was at stake versus how the show was run. After my roommates and I had decided to set out on our own means, events began to change my perception of financial status, partly because we were starting to lose control of what little bills we had. I had a lead foot problem, and while I certainly never considered it excessive, it was excessive how often I started getting caught speeding. Thousands of dollars over a few years before I would finally learn my lesson, but when I got yet another ticket for expired tags in Blue Springs, I had little idea that my refusal to pay a fine for what I saw as paperwork would mark an intriguing future set of legal shenanigans. We could barely keep the lights on in our shitty little one-bedroom apartment, so for damn sure we weren't spending almost half a 2-week paycheck for nitpicky regulations to those flush already. I mean, if I had that kind of money, there wouldn't have been a problem to begin with. I finally landed a job without the help of anyone else at Little Caesars, who were at least going to offer me a steady 30 hours with the ability to pick more up. The fast food store was a couple blocks from the apartments, so a lot less driving, no extra money spent on bullshit rules that just fucked people who were poor to begin with. You look at vehicles alone, and the amount of wealth required was exorbitant even in the early 2010s. I had to ensure out of a $600 bi-weekly paycheck that the $140 insurance got covered, roughly $60 to $80 for gas, any spare money clung to desperately in case of mechanical failures, and generally once a year spend 2 hours at minimum in the Department of Motor Vehicles to spend another $60 after dropping 70 at the courthouse for taxes. We've not even touched other expenses of living. After moving up forcefully through management of Little Caesars, I started driving again and for a while got lucky, mostly by not speeding as often. I was smoking a lot of weed now, and there was no need to bring more shit down on my head. But success breeds laziness, and while driving between Kansas City and Leavenworth, I got pulled over for speeding and expired tags with a small pipe for smoking. Now I imagine there's a lot of different ways the whole situation could have gone from there, but to keep the story short, I was given tickets for the tags and paraphernalia, and when I went to court, I gave our Sixth Amendment a shot going before the judge without a lawyer. When you're white and play dumb but polite, you can learn some shit. I was immediately informed that unless I got representation, I would face a $1,000 fine and a year in jail. Missouri 2012, folks. Now, how Platte County wasn't aware of Blue Springs, I have not a clue. I pretty much wiped out what I had saved to get a lawyer, magically reducing the Platte pipe possession charge to like a $500 fine and a year of probation, all the while Blue Springs had my license as suspended. I would discover this after getting pulled over once again for tags by Blue Springs officers, and they would basically take my whole check to bail myself out and retrieve my vehicle. However, this potentially serious issue went a whole different route. My father was with me in the courthouse on the day of the hearing and saw a friend of his who, as judge and lawyer himself, knew the judge presiding over my case. I never saw the judge again, and I was immediately able to reinstate my license. Jank and Anna now had every ounce of my attention on this subject and more. A punitive system designed to bleed dry those who've committed small offenses can easily lead to desperation. If not for my roommates, I might not have even allowed myself to be degraded over asking my parents for assistance. Certainly wouldn't have remained a free citizen. Anyway, my initial shock was followed by self-repudiation for naivety over what I technically already knew. I'm not going to chalk everything up to systemic racism, for I see another problem as more fundamental schism amongst us. Networking was never my strong suit, and my unfortunate habit of spending money like it grows on trees when in good company doesn't encourage me to repeat said ventures as often as I feel I should. I can only sit here and let my mind run wild with speculations of how that friend and judge were acquainted. Maybe they would treat each other to lunch occasionally. Maybe they attended the same school for some unbeknownst amount of time. Maybe they were friends themselves, or hell, perhaps they just owned similar stock or attended some church function together. Doesn't matter. Certainly my roommates wouldn't have received such leniency even as white as I am. Which leaves me to ponder about those who don't have family in the know, who might not have a suit or clean work uniform to present themselves before the court. Perhaps visible tattoos or just a different skin tone. Fuck, what about just maybe a limited vocabulary aiding in an impression of defiance, intended or not? This is why, as tempting as it is, I can't just throw injustice at the feet of economics. But every day seems to bring contradictory news to batter against my belief. Stephen Donziger should be nominated for goddamn sainthood. Around 2011, he went toe-to-toe with Chevron, a major oil and natural gas company, in a $9 billion attempt to achieve some form of reparations for the fuckery pulled on Ecuadorians. Let me be specific instead of spiteful. Donziger, a Harvard law graduate and former public defender, helped lead the case against Chevron for pollution caused in part by leaks from the majority of the oil wells in Lago Agrio, resulting in the death of local fauna and foliage. Farmland became barren, cancer rates spiking, and quality of life plummeting. Chevron contends that the entire judicial process carried out in Ecuadorian courts, even though they sought these courts, was corrupt, and the malpractice was accomplished in hopes of digging into Chevron's $300+ billion pockets. The records of ill management and consequential methods from both sides paints the age-old no innocent parties picture, but I only see a few individuals worth hundreds of billions of dollars. I only read of Chevron's lawyers trying to run the circuits internationally. It wasn't Americans working for Chevron that suffered house arrest in a last-ditch effort to preserve the cost margins for the company, not over a measly $9 billion settlement, but the bankrupting precedent it would set. I've totally overshot a glaringly poorly thought statement. What about Americans working for this benevolent, time-tested, vital corporate provider? I do not speak of upper management, affiliated lobby groups, closely tied law firms, collegiate associates in schools, scientists hired for the labs, representatives in other countries. I'm sure the list goes on. The individuals who work your gas stations, stock your offices, cargo bays, carry your goods, extract your produce, held responsible for cleaning your messes, are amongst those I would call average Americans. I wonder if they feel like your trickle-down charity isn't just house arrest under a nom de plume. Nobody else wonder and fear over the COVID regulations implemented by businesses? Nah, that was government. Nobody else for the last 2 decades feel like making incrementally more gets you dramatically less? Nah, inflation and government spending. Nobody else watches businesses, institutions tighten the ship on all the nostalgic accomplishments from our favorite stories? Nah, newest generation's name here in government. Am I the only motherfucker living recognizing these human beings act in such ways and we all just cheer for our favorite dogmatic explanation? You're not special, Chevron. You're just fucking unique. I could siphon through any number of companies across any category of economics and single out behavior I find indefensible, as I already have in the case of your predecessor, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. The practices you partake in are replicated ad nauseum across all fields. Clone's stock profiteering off a shady medical product, the Bureau of Chemistry, aka the FDA's compliance in almost every step taken during the Prohibition, the disregard for citizens' lives, constructing, relocating infrastructure where beneficial to the creator, not the inhabitant, i.e. Dakota Access Pipeline, Flint, Michigan, water supply, Central and South Florida flood control projects, levees and canals, convenience and fast food chains, national reclamation from simple, uncoordinated, independent local shops, the military's testing around the Marshall Islands, the Department of Transportation's continuous fidgeting with regulations at the behest of those with the capital to meet them, Trump's godforsaken fucking border wall to stop my asinine tirade before spiraling further. Are these the examples of a free market? I'll gladly slave under communism, you fucking hypocrites. Jesus fucking Christ. You are not exempt either, TYT. Everyone seemed to lose their minds when the 45th presidential election came to its unclimactic resolution, and once again all I see are dollar signs at the heart of it all. When Trump took the Republican nomination, I was far too confident that here at least, the people who I knew as Republican would finally see what the symbol of their beliefs on how our country should continue to operate translated to those elected by them. Instead, I was met with the country could use a good business leader, or something to that effect. Really, let's set aside his methods to achieve the status of successful businessmen. That's what we needed? More monetary management? Your bosses seemingly proselytize your interests at a priority not equal to their own. pursue avenues for you to have the economic freedom in the development of your hobbies on your own land right down the road to call you neighbor. Exude patience in the face of your mistakes, outbursts while under stressors. Refrain from ridicule when perceived insufficient understanding from you is made known. And if you nodded along to those statements, you're the motherfucker I'm shitting on right now. I was not just speechless, I was reactionless. I had no idea how to continue forward when those who had been screaming for change, hollering fraud as Hillary cemented her position as the Democratic nominee, went immediately to apologetics as if there truly was a difference between her and the family buddy Trump. The Clintons and Trumps are known to fraternize with one another. How was everybody convinced that their guy was for us? Not what's been the motivation for all this country's prior actions. Personal wealth. Here I am making an ass out of you and me again. Mostly me. Alright. Hit the bowl. Reorganized. It broke what heart I have when the aftermath of all the doubling down led to so many sociological fractures amongst those I live around, those I listen to, and the communities I found out about. At the same time, how could I fault it when I too felt as though the climax to the movie was about to peak? Thankfully, my parents never got caught up in the Christian apocalyptic hype wave of Obama being the Antichrist. I found it truly amusing, though, to see so many quick to bandy the term about now fawning over Trump, even to compare him to the deity their faith takes its name from. Let me help you understand my sick pleasure. Luke 21:8. The time draweth near, and therefore take heed that ye be not deceived. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. Go ye not therefore after them. Revelations 13:2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Interpret that how you please. I know what dumbass connections I had made. Just because the authority figures in my life didn't scream about the Antichrist doesn't mean I didn't spend a significant portion of my child hearing about the end times.